what really went on with the boxing scandal going on in the Olympics?
Yeah, so very specifically on that boxing scandal. So I don't think anyone seriously, with any information at all, was claiming that these were trans athletes. So the suggestion was that they are athletes with DSDs, and they might be, but nobody knows. That is not public knowledge, and I certainly don't. Excuse me, I certainly don't know that either. How it all became the story that it did in the Olympics, I think, relates to, I suppose, if you go back a few years, then the International Olympic Committee changed what they previously had as guidelines about how to about eligibility of both trans athletes and those with DSDs for the female category. And I think it was 2021, they produced just a framework which had 10 principles as part of it. And many of the principles almost everybody agrees with. And some of them are people don't all agree with. And I would be one of those as well that doesn't agree with all 10 principles, such as that no assumption of or presumption of advantage should apply to any group of athletes. So that's one of the principles, is that you should not have a presumption. Many, including me, would argue that a trans woman athlete has it is safe to presume they have an advantage because if they have been through male puberty. So that's an example of treating a group of people as one, as opposed to always looking on an individual basis. So by having this framework in relation to the DSD at the recent Olympics, then what the framework did as well was essentially devolve decisions or regulatory sort of policy completely to the individual sport federations. So, cycling, athletics, boxing, and all the others were left to have their own devices, left to come up with their own regulations regarding both DSD athletes and trans athletes. And the reality is that many of the sport federations just don't have the resources or the time or the expertise or any of those to develop coherent policy that applies to their sport. So many of them just literally have not. They have a blank space where a policy might be. Others have just continued what the old IOC guidance was before 2021. They just haven't updated any documentation since then. And some have tried to write their own regulations, but perhaps not surprisingly, they've come up with maybe different regulations to the next sport, even though at the heart of it, there's some very similar physiological capacity properties that apply to, for example, athletics and rowing and cycling. Ultimately, you're still talking about things like that happen during puberty. You're talking about growth of muscle mass and hemoglobin concentration and so on. So at the recent Olympics, then you had the IOC saying largely all federations do what they want to do, and then the specific case in terms of the Federation for Amateur Boxing was that they had recent other difficult sort of accusations of I believe corruption a little bit outside my sphere, but and the IOC had essentially removed the authority from them to govern boxing in the Olympics. So the IOC assumed that responsibility, and they only have this framework that devolves regulatory responsibility to the federations. So they just went for a policy that I suppose agrees with their own principles about, which means that there would be no real testing of athletes, and there wouldn't be a presumption about someone's status and those kinds of things. So ultimately they went with what someone had sort of their legal status as on their passport, whereas the IBA that were had the power removed from them, they claimed to have done some sort of genetic test regarding chromosomes, but they didn't release the full detail of that. So I don't think anybody quite knows.
That's what I think where we found this kind of, in invert commas, misinformation being sent around, was the fact that I think all of the assumptions and probably the judgments that were very, very quickly placed on the athletes were through the lens of being trans athletes. From what you're saying, is that's a category where you can start to make presumptions if they've been through the puberty in which the sex that they were born at.
So I think this is fair comment. I and the majority of scientists that have commented in this area would agree with that statement. Yes, with the current state of evidence, then yes, you can make that conclusion that they would be carrying advantages into the female category, which otherwise you wouldn't normally have in the female category. And that obviously is disrupts the fairness in the category, and where there's direct physical contact, and particularly in combat sport, then potentially the safety of other competitors. So yes, regarding trans athletes, I would make the big distinction then about DSD in that even if someone, and some scientists do think that a similar policy should be applied to someone with a DSD, maybe if they also have a Y chromosome, as some athletes do, even they would agree with me that the volume of direct evidence about athletes with DSD is almost zero. Perhaps understandably, because there's not very many of them and they haven't been participants in research studies and so on. But the direct evidence is almost zero. And there are a whole load of ethical consequences about having a testing regime which you would need to do to identify those with DSDs. Whereas in contrast with the transgender athletes, then one clear difference from DSD athletes is that a trans athlete knows exactly their own personal history, and there's no medical information that would be revealed to them as a result of some testing program. Whereas for athletes with DSDs, that's precisely what would have to happen.
If you've enjoyed that clip, then you can watch the full unedited episode by just clicking right here. Go on, go.